All right, welcome to another episode of Safer Communities Canada, where we try to have brave conversations with people with lived experiences to try to find solutions to violence through prevention, intervention, and interruption. And this is part of our knowledge mobilization efforts with the Center for Community Safety and Roots of Violence here at YAAACE. We're very excited today to have our very own Mr. Greg Leslie in the house. He's a registered clinical social worker. As a community worker, he has a community worker diploma from George Brown, a bachelor's degree from Toronto Metropolitan University, and currently very close to finishing his Master of Social Work at University of Waterloo. His professional qualifications include 25 years in social services, and for the last 7 years, the founding director in private practice at Educare Self-Care Studio, where you can learn more at Educaris, spelled EDUCARESS.com, around some of the services and the stakeholder Greg works with. We have the privilege of working with him directly with our Towards Peace and New Narrative programs, and we'll kind of dissect that a little bit more throughout our conversations. And as usual, me and founding director Devon Jones will kind of guide the conversation and look to kind of go deep into some of these questions we're grappling with, and really at a time when tensions are a little bit high in the community right now, given the recent incidences and the random shootings that have taken place. So we'll start out light, Greg. We want the audience members to get to know you a little bit. So maybe you can tell us, how did you get into the field and into this practice? For me, I know there isn't too many Black social workers that come with your lived experiences, having grown up in Jane and Finch, having been a hooper and a basketball person yourself. So what would you like to share with our audience and listeners around your story and how you got here?
So I'll just share my academic journey beyond living in the community and growing up in the community. So lived in the community from 1983 to 2003, but still worked in the community thereafter. Just based on my academic journey, I went to school at Runnymede. After Runnymede, got a basketball scholarship, played in Minnesota, Minneapolis, Rainy River Community College for 2 years. I made the decision to come back home. I was homesick. It was a culture shock. So I went back to George Brown, where I got my community worker diploma. Went to a junior college, so the classes were transferable. So I was able to bring my transcript to George Brown and got advanced to the second year in the community worker program. So finished that and spent many years working initially with Basketball Ontario and then working in recreation. Transitioned that and then started working in group homes. From working in group homes, just based on the transitional work there, I felt like I wanted to gain more education. So I got my bachelor's of social work and then started working at Luminous, which in the past was Griffin Center. So worked there for 15 years. In that role, I think I grew the most. I think from a learning perspective, was able to really do a lot of clinical social work. At that time, worked at a program called Youth Connect, where we developed programs for education, developed program with the hospital, developed programs for the justice system, and we became an in-between crisis response for community-related violence, for individuals that had first episode psychosis, or for individuals that were being diagnosed and entering the community that had mental health. So helping community, individuals, and families just really have a greater understanding of mental health. So a lot of that work was psychoeducational. After 15 years of working in that environment, went into private practice, which you stated over the last 7/8 years. And during that course of the time, doing a focus on my master's, which is focused on health and social work.
Amazing. I mean, you covered a lot of ground, and I think that speaks to how versatile you can be working with some of vulnerable youth and adults that we support here at YAAACE, and you provide the care coordination. I'll pass it on to D. D, what do you want to ask Greg?
Yeah, Greg, my first question from working in Jane and Finch for over 2 decades and seen the number of young people exposed to violence, and looking at, you know, issues around academic underachievement, moral decay, and so on. My question is, what are the sociological and psychological implications of young people who are constantly exposed to violence?
I think that's a phenomenal question. And I would also say that's the nature of my work. Working with individuals impacted by mental health and trauma, and being able to do a screening. So some of the social factors that you named and inequities that they face is just like living in communities where there's a higher level of poverty, living in communities where there's a higher level of marginalization, being over-policed and under-policed, dealing with education as it relates to safe schools and kids dropping out, but not necessarily having the right level of care, which in oftentimes pushes them out. So when these individuals are impacted by violence, from doing the screening, what we've learned is individuals are having impact of trauma, which are leading to health-related issues, to whether it be heart disease or asthma, or obesity, or just not having a lot of access to food. They're also dealing with mental health that include anxiety and depression. And for some, based on the trauma impacts that they have, they may have a predisposition to a history of mental health that now, due to the trauma event, have led them to, for example, to now shows of signs of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and different personality disorders. So it really depends on if that individual and if the event happened during the onset of when individuals would normally have the onset of mental health, which would be in their adolescence at about 12, 13, or 14, if they had a predisposition. And if they're dealing with trauma and grief-related issues, it could start from the initial shock, the disbelief and the denial, which people often talk about being numb. They're dealing with anger, and I think anger needs to be unpacked, because when we're dealing with anger, we're dealing with anger related to the circumstance or the perpetrator, the systems involved, family. So it could be a lot of different variables and factors that lead to anger. Then you're dealing with insomnia. Then you're dealing with hyper vigilance, with people become super paranoid. So the example that I often talk about in my sessions is Spider-Man, the character, has anxiety, and this is why he's able to recognize the impending danger. And I think to always be in that state leads to a level of burnout. So getting people to understand the need to practice self-care, which is why the screening is important, because people need to understand what the stressors are to be able to recognize that, these behaviors are a result of the trauma. The unfortunate thing for a lot of individuals is that they live in a community that there's ongoing rival and related gun violence. So those symptoms oftentimes never go away. For some, it's oftentimes a protective factor. If I don't stay on the swivel, how do I continue to protect myself in a community that seems to be unsafe just based on the living circumstances? The clients that I find, not to minimize people's living circumstances, that I find have a lot of success is individuals and families that have a choice to move out of community housing and to move to new environments where they're not bombarded by some of these social ills and some of these determinants that would further impact their health. So for individuals and families that are able to make different choices, the health responses change. And I know it may be a long-winded question, but there's so much nuances as it relates to trauma and violence, and really talking about trauma-informed care and how do individuals and families and communities and systems help to be a bipartisan of situations like this.
Yeah, because a concern is the fact that after these traumatic incidents, there almost never any sort of medical intervention or social work or psychological intervention. So if I'm a young person growing up exposed to this ongoing culture of violence, and you're exposed to it, and then there isn't a conversation around the atrocity that you just witnessed, or there isn't a conversation around what you have experienced as relates to unpacking it, or someone to walk you through some sort of discourse that this normalized behavior is normal, then then how do you grow up and how are you formed as a person? You know, so the concern is like there isn't that kind of support almost ever. And then from your position, you know, what should that support look like? From a student in school that has witnessed this homicide, what should happen the next day or two or week or month? Like, I'm asking you, what should that support look like for students who's constantly bombarded by this violence and exposed to this level of violence?
So it's about having what we call care coordination, but I think it's fair to say that trauma changes the body and the brain and its makeup. So this event will change the individual. So to your question, the response needs to be or should be a multiple of things. I think first there has to be accountability around the need to want or to be garnered some level of support. So I could say for the people or the individual that I've come into contact with, in answering your questions that need support, I think there should be some screening. There should be some understanding that trauma will change the body and its makeup, and individuals clearly understanding what these stressors are. So being able to identify the stressors that are related to the trauma event is important. Being able to let's just say for an example, if the individual is dealing with the trauma symptom and they were a victim, being able to have physiotherapy might be important to the individuals to deal with injury, because individuals that survive these level of violence, they're they might be otherly disabled now. So going from an able-bodied individual to someone that has disability is important. So having the right services that are connected to the person, so that they're able to account for those services, right? So we're talking about physical services and psychological services. We're talking about social supports that are needed around programming to ensure that there's maybe some potential to some lifestyle changes, right? So there's to be some unpacking of like what is happening in the home and in the environment, what's happening in the school and out of the school, and what's the lifestyle this person is associated with. Are they connected to some level of street-related crime, or were they a bystander? So I think we need to understand, in social work, we would say call the social location. What is the makeup of this individual? What does their lifestyle look like? From a ministry perspective, what they assess is the level of nervousness and how is this person able to get back to their way of life. What was their baseline before? How close are we able to bring that person back to their baseline? Did they have mental health before? Do they have mental health now? So to answer your question is going to be really based on the impact and connecting the individual to the right services and people for those things. Unfortunately, if these individuals still live in the community where these services are not in place, chances are these symptoms will get worse. Based on the impact.
And I really like that question, because I think when we, very commonly, I think adverse childhood experiences is used, which is about 10 questions, but it really focuses on the individual, from maybe abuse in the home environment, but I don't think the questions grasp the community exposure to violence, which can sometimes be more indirect, but that constant exposure to it. And to your point, how does it even change the development of the brain from the early years, and then add other forms of trauma and systemic barriers. So, I wanted to ask you these questions, which are kind of taking these more theoretical concepts and just to break it down to simpler things for our listeners. And as mentioned, and for folks who are not familiar, in New Narrative and Towards Peace, we provide that care coordination to what Greg explained around what are their needs and how do we support them to kind of mitigate those risk factors. Some words we commonly used are trauma-informed care and culture-reflective practices. And I wanted you to, in like 2 or 3 sentences, in really plain language, what is trauma-informed care?
So trauma-informed care has 5 pillars. And again, just being able to break it down into small layman terms just for the audience. The key goal is safety. And beyond safety, not re-traumatizing individuals based on their circumstance. And oftentimes, people have relived their stories and their circumstances based on their flashbacks, based on triggers. And these triggers come in the way of things we see,
Yeah.
things that we may have smell, we may have eaten something on that particular day. So just really dealing with the five senses. So trauma-informed care is very much about having empathy and compassion and not re-traumatizing the individual, but being careful to understand as much as you can what happened and trying to find a less intrusive way to get to understanding what happened while trying to be mindful that some of what we do will arise some of the situations. So as a social worker, I think I always tell people that a lot of the questions that I do may bring this back. It's not my intent or impact to further traumatize you, but to get clarity. And I'll oftentimes also say, you know what, I'll probably only ask you this question once because we need to lay context. But beyond that, once I have an understanding, I'll try to be that in-between or buffer if other systems are involved. So what that means is signing consents and release of information. So I'll be the one that's kind of, being a gatekeeper to the information and a librarian to be able to share that with other agencies and to get them to perform the duty that is asked of them without restoring what is happening. And there's another part to the question that you asked around beyond trauma-informed care.
No, that's great. I mean, the other piece I wanted you to just say, we say at YAAACE we provide culturally reflective services. What does that exactly mean to you, given your experiences?
So it's very much about understanding cultural dynamics, to be honest. And in a role as a social worker or in a profession that works with psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, and so forth, these individuals and these roles carry weight. So to have someone that's of similar identity is important, because then you're not retelling some of these cultural nuances that take place when situations like that just happen.
So can you give us like an example? I know I have one in my mind, but I don't know, maybe you can give a different one. Like in many cultures growing up, you get a little beating when you act up, right? And that's in some ways normalized.
Be a normalized discipline.
Given the culture and the country's maybe policies. But as many of us as immigrants transition to Canada,
right,
we learn that that's not okay. And there's a different way that you have to kind of discipline. So, what are your thoughts on that? Or if you have a different example around that culture reflective piece?
So I think whether it relates to culture, I think that is a good example. And discipline is a good example across each culture. Some individuals and some homes we live in, they're talking parents. I think when we deal with individuals, what we're talking about is corporal punishment or beating individuals. I know that stems from colonialism and, slavery, and individuals specifically from African and Indo-Caribbean communities using that as a way of discipline. So I know that that's generational discipline. So for me, I tried to create the cultural context around how this started and how this continued to carry out, and to help families understand the Canadian context, I would say. I would say that in situations where I've had to deal with clients and families that have spanked or hit their child, you're allowed to put your child over your knee and to slap them on their bottom, but what becomes abuse when we're hitting them in other areas. So I think there's a conversation around what happened and how did it happen, and trying to unpack it so that the behavior is not criminalized and there's context around it. So the representation comes in being, again, that buffer in helping the justice system understand the cultural nuances and where it stems from, and making those connections so that when and if it happens, that the family is not penalized based on lived experience to culture, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great point before I pass it on to D, because I know I remember when I was teaching in the social work program, the statistics where a child was taken away from a racialized family was much higher compared to some other families. And because the practitioners didn't have that cultural understanding or that knowledge, and we know taking a child away from the family is often the last option because it's very harmful. And it's a hard transition.
That's true.
Yeah. Greg, we're seeing such an uptake in younger and younger young people perpetrating very violent acts.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us doing this frontline work, we're very concerned. What do you think might be some of the impetus contributing to this phenomenon, and how can we proactively engage? And from the point of intervention, how can we again engage?
I would agree with you. There is definitely a high uptake in community-related violence, and then again, not to tell you what you don't know, but we've seen a contribution of this through the year of the gun, which is 2005, where it just seems to be more community-related violence, and we know that there are 13 priority communities in and across Toronto that are identified to have these levels of violence. So it goes back to some of the social conditions that happen in these communities. And it's not to always blame it on systems and structures, but if schools are a contributor of the prison, from school to prison to pipeline, then we have to consider what is happening in schools and what's happening around education. So that is one variable. We also have to look at issues around social insecurities, around finances, where families are living paycheck to paycheck. And we're living in a time now where we see people are paying their rent because it's they don't have access to food. And we're seeing a time historically where food banks are being used, right? So we're looking at, contributing determinants of housing, income, environment, education, mental health. So all of these things, need, at some point need to be addressed. And a lot of it is education, understanding individuals, understanding their rights and having access to avenues, which they get in YAAACE, and through YAAACE's programs in New Narrative and Towards Peace. Understanding these social conditions, helping families, what we say, navigate systems. Again, using that word of being the buffer by doing case management and making the right connections and solving some of these nuances for families. However, we live in communities where me growing up in this community, me witnessing drug dealing, in the 80s, and that transitioned into, people, finding different ways of fostering income. But with drug dealing came over policing and different levels of violence. And I think this escalating in the 80s have created community dynamics where communities have chopped up and have, become turfs and have become oppositions, for each other. So say that to say, we need to solve some of the problems that lead people into gangs, some of the problems that chop these communities up, where individuals don't feel safe and they participate in being a bystander to violence because they don't feel the system is protecting them enough to be a witness to say that, I seen this or I want to have solutions. People don't feel safe. So I think this is an intersection of on different levels where problems need to be solved. But first and foremost, people need to feel like the justice system is going to give them insulation enough to be able to be a witness to a crime, for crimes to be solved, for people to feel like, I feel safe here because if something happens, we're going to make the right decisions. And I say that the last thing that I'll add is growing up in this community, I've needed to change whether it be friendships or the company that I've kept, because I've had to draw a line in the sand that I'm responsible, law-abiding citizen. That's not going to be a bystander to things, because I've had clients that I've come in contact with that have died as a result of gun violence that has led to my own burnout. So I've had to make a decision that am I going to be a professional and a law-abiding citizen that is going to help to change the trajectory of what happens by, changing my life, my lifestyle, and the people and the company that I keep, and being a person that says, you know what, I'm not going to let my friends or family be a victim to something that I've seen, and participate in the no snitching. If you do something in my periphery and I'm able to account for it, I'm not going to sleep with knowing that something happened to you and didn't speak up. So I think it's very much about changing the narrative around the not snitching and buying into what we call culture, because this culture is becoming dangerous.
You know what? That's a really good point, and it really transitions well to the next question I had. Was when we think about like the dominant ideologies or discourse around what it means to be a man in our current context, with the representations we see in rap videos, films, music, right? You know, we want to provide that counter narrative, kind of some of the tips. And I wanted to ask this question from a practical, suggestions that you bring with your wealth of experience. How do we counter that culture on a large scale, but more on an individual level? So, for example, you get assigned a client, or you got a parent that doesn't know how to deal with their child because the behavior is getting a bit spiraled and out of control. How do you have that conversation? So let's say I show up on our first therapy session. If you ask me, tell me about your trauma, I might be like, why should I tell you about my trauma? Like, I don't know nothing, right? So how do you navigate that piece of building relationship for your client to be actually willing to trust you and be vulnerable? Because our culture does not make it easy to be vulnerable.
I would agree. I would say that I'm privileged to be a Black man that grew up in a community that understands, quote unquote, this culture that people have tapped into. If I was going to speak for myself, I would say this is not culture. Culture is very much about understanding your language, the food you eat, and developing an infrastructure. So I would argue that these behaviors around violence aren't culture. I think you said it well when we have become codependent on idolizing behaviors that become sensationalized, that we carry out. So oftentimes when I see individuals that are impacted, let's just be specific around gun violence, and they do decide to see me, I think that comes from a stage of readiness. They've passed the contemplation state. They want to take action because they realize that there's some mental health here, or there's a level of paranoia. In the screening that I do for these clients, regardless of you're a victim or perpetrator, trauma-related symptoms are the same. And once it's inside of your system, if it's not managed, it can morph into mental health, notably depression and anxiety. And then again, it just spirals. So oftentimes, to your point, when individuals are talking to me, specifically coming from one of these identified communities where violence happens, they've already recognized that I've known. So when they're talking to me, whether they're using street-related slang and they're calling individuals ops and so on and so forth, I understand exactly what they're talking about. So there's this comfort of not having to say certain things. And so then the conversation changes because they recognize, hey, you know what's happening, so I don't have to repeat particular things. So now when I'm talking about the impact of trauma and mental health, they're keenly listening, because now I'm then identifying that, I'll ask them, were you shocked when you got shot and or heard about the situation? They'll say yes, and I'll say why. So by the time I ask them the 75 questions that's on a screening sheet, and I'm now paraphrasing that, the reason that you have insomnia is because you continue to live in a community where there's ongoing violence. So when you're hearing a firecracker, tire pop, or people screaming, these are some of the things that are not no longer silent to you. They're so evident that these things are going to bother you, so you can't sleep. Now when you're becoming cynical and short and frustrated, I understand, because life has a greater urgency to you because you just survived a shooting. So again, I'm going through all of these scenarios. I'm explaining the whys, and I'm able to pinpoint and hit everything on the head. So it's just like aha moments for them at each juncture. So now when I'm giving them what we call our prognosis and outcome, they keenly listen. And again, all while I'm probably asking them, what is your thought? What's your thought associated to this behavior? And what are you doing? And I'm already knowing all of these things based on what they're sharing. So now when I'm saying, you need to be mindful of these 50 things of the 75 things that I've asked you. If you're not managing these stressors, your stressors are going to become mental health. There's no asking you. I'm telling you at this point. You know what I mean? So it goes from understanding what happened, understanding the symptoms, and being able to diagnose through the screening.
Well said. Greg, the word disproportionality is a word we use a lot at YAAACE as it relates to overrepresentation of youth in the justice system, underachievement of students, etc., etc. One disproportionality is a large number of young people dealing with the issue around abandonment or not knowing a parent, usually a father. What do you think the impacts of this abandonment or this detachment is from this other parent? Because a lot of the disproportionality, a lot of the vulnerabilities and the volatilities around the disproportionalities we mentioned, that is a commonality. The absenteeism of that particular parent, usually
The male.
from the patriarchal side or the father's side. How do we explain that? How do you rationalize that through the lens of a social worker or through social work?
Again, I think it's understanding community dynamics, and a lot of it is it comes from, again, having a social understanding of history, the impacts of colonialism, I would say, with a dabbling of what does it mean, what is a family, and what are the family dynamics. I think for me, if I'm going to implicate myself, I grew up in a single parent home, but I had good male role models in uncles and participating in basketball, in coaches, and having mentors. So I think when males grow up and they don't have male role models, it's very much how are they learning? How are they learning masculine behaviors? And then the question is, what does it mean to be a male? I have a workshop that I do where we call it the male box, where we look at, the intersection of identity. So to answer your question, I would say, how was that individual raised and how were they socialized and what males did they have in their life, and how do they view male role models in their life? Because oftentimes those male role models become punitive and more operate in their life in destructive manner. So it's very much about, again, how were they socialized? What were the male role models like in their life? I really believe in mentoring and modeling behavior, and really being able to disrupt those things as they impact males specifically. So it's very much around conversation and understanding that being a male is not just about bravado, and really challenging how they were raised, and not in any way comparing or criticizing, but giving options and really creating a wider net and landscape. In my role and in my work, I've worked a lot with individuals in these settings, and what I've found that has helped is exposure and psychoeducation and conversation, and having a conversation about dynamics. When I grew up in communities like this is how it was, and this is how, and validating their reality, and really questioning, some of these things for individuals willing to have these conversations. And oftentimes there are far more similarities than there are differences, but for males that, take on, I would say, the negative identities of poor social interaction, there has to be a willingness to have these conversations to unpack some of these things. So I think it's very much about the willingness and the need to change the trajectory based on maybe being shot, being incarcerated, being homeless, or just having family breakdown. Being able to stop the trajectory and first of all, foremost, finding stability, and solving in situations around hunger and poverty, and providing somebody just compassion and care. And oftentimes when you show you care, you're able to change some of these behaviors, because to be very honest, some of these behaviors from my experience come in the way of protection. You have males that have never been involved in any situation, but they live in a community like this where there's random shootings and they feel like they're a target. So now they've gotten a weapon to protect themselves. So I think these situations have a lot of variables, a lot of circumstances. So again, it goes back to understanding the situation, being able to impact it, and being able to help individuals understand where they are.
Yeah,
Sounds good. Thank
very
you.
insightful. And, I think we're going to try to wrap it up with the next two questions, given our time. So my question, and I really like how you push the conversation from beyond just focusing on the individual to kind of looking at the family unit, and then even going wider to look at, their ecological environment, the community, the ecosystem, and the relations of important people or lack of it in their life. So, what advice would you give to our listeners who may be struggling with depression, and they might even not know that language, that it is depression, but they're struggling internally with their feelings and emotions and behavior, and a lack of positive coping mechanisms? Because we know often folks might go to alcohol or weed or other things, and it can get to a point where it's out of control and it really impacts their day-to-day. So what advice would you give those folks around trying to make sense of those feelings and coping with it constructively?
Yeah. I would say for any diagnosis, whether it be depression, anxiety, and some of the more serious ones being schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and bipolar, is about behavior. And I know I talked about earlier baseline. So it's just like, if the individual is dealing with depression, how much has your behavior changed? Are they stopped going to school? Are they isolating? Did they stop eating? So really, again, the focus of a good social worker is understanding symptoms and looking at how these symptoms intersect and impact each other. If this individual is sad for 2 weeks, then it's maybe something that we could get around. But if the depression is lasting longer than a month, then it becomes something more serious, because we're looking at how has their life changed. Are they going to school? Are they going to work? Are they socializing? Are they stopped enjoying things that they used to once enjoy? Are they able to be motivated? So you're really getting a clear gambit of what is happening. So some of the advice that I would give is just really understanding yourself, being able to clearly articulate what is happening, specifically if you're talking to a doctor, a friend, or an advocate, a social worker, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. Just really understand symptoms, because that's essentially what our job is to do. Understand the varied symptoms, understand how these symptoms compound, and being able to help individuals understand their stressors and minimize them, with potentially changing their behaviors. That might include some talk therapy, some medication, a change of lifestyle, a change of environment. So I think it's hard to answer without understanding what the circumstances are and what we're remedying. If the individual is depressed because they're going to be evicted and go out of their home and they have children, I can understand that depression. So we're looking at the reality and the circumstances and try to remedy those things. If after we remedy those things and we see those things persisting, I think then it's clear to say, the mental health is probably a bit more severe than we thought. Then there needs to be a clinical intervention, where it might be a referral to a hospital, a community health center, coming to a new narrative or towards peace. Where we could help to solve and help you navigate some of those things, so the right systems are in place to create some level of stability in your life.
Yeah, and there's brochures on the YAAACE website around the eligibility for those programs. I highly recommend our listeners, especially if you're in the Humber River, Black Creek residents, to check it out. And COVID really, I think, amplified that piece around mental health for many people, where maybe they were dismissive. I think COVID kind of made that more real.
But one thing that I add, as you say, that comes to mind, I think oftentimes individuals living in communities like this have mental health, but their behaviors become bravado and they become perpetrators of crime because they lack or seem to lack the awareness to understand their behaviors are psychotic or homicidal. Now, because of their mental health, their willingness to commit a crime is raised. And again, I don't want to pathologize mental health, but oftentimes these individuals are vulnerable, and you have people in community taking advantage of these people or these individuals, and they become the perpetrators of crime because they're not in their right mind, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And now the situation spirals, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of the Review of the Roots of Violence report that said the intersection of racism and poverty puts youth in the highest risk category in terms of criminality and poor decision making,
Right.
which are systemic pieces, but trickle down, to your point, to impact individuals.
And I would add, what I will add to that, I think is crucial, is like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Did the mental health come first or the social inequities?
Yeah.
Right? Because both could be part and parcel of the contributing factor to their mental health. So oftentimes we need to decipher what came first to be able to implement some level of intervention and ongoing safety for the individual.
Pass it out to D for the last and the money question.
The money question. I came across a book a few years ago, and the author asked, a very profound question. And the question was, she was dealing with a particular client who was having some challenges, and the question was, or she implored us to ask, in dealing with, hard to serve, vulnerable youth, it's not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you. So to close it off, how would you, as a social worker, challenge us to not demonize kids? And it's easy to say what's wrong with you. How would you challenge best practice through the discourse of what has happened to you? And I know you covered some of that in some of the pieces that we had
but I think it's a
mentioned.
good question. But I think oftentimes it's some of the simplest things to do. And I think, it's easier to speak to you both because you guys are professionals that understand this. But I think, from what I've learned that has been helpful for me to stay even killed is understanding, we're at the determinants of health that, helps people to recognize that there are social inequities that put people at disadvantaged situations, and then understanding what marginalization means and these impacts means. So when we're looking at, what happened, we're looking at it more broadly, right? And understanding the individual and their circumstances comes first. So for me, I come from a place of being curious because I absolutely want to know what your story is. And oftentimes I am non-judgmental because I've been able to be affluent enough to understand privilege. Privilege is being able to live in a home where everybody has a room. From being educated, I have learned to understand if there's a 3-bedroom home and 10 people live in it, that's still homelessness because there's not enough rooms to accommodate people, right? So it's just being able to understand some of these things and understand and question my privilege at all the times. I have access to a home, I have access to higher education, I have access to money to make choices around my health. So all of these things helped me to understand my beginnings and growing up in communities that were considered, underserved or at risk. And I use that to galvanize me to come out of this poverty mindset and to be abundant in my life and the choices that I made. And me giving back is being able to help people understand that within themselves, and so that they can make different choices. So I'm never too high in recognizing my own privilege and understand that I've been put in this position to be a person that helps people understand the position that they're in and to raise suggestion and awareness in them understanding the situation so that they can make better choices for their lives that are normally connected to other systems and people, so that their lives aren't worse, right? And oftentimes people are coming to me at where their problem is a 99% bad. Like, what happened when it was 5% bad? And you didn't think it was bad enough? And now we're putting on all of these fires that anyone, I would say anyone, I would generalizing, anyone that has been able to live through circumstances would not be able to go through it. So I think oftentimes individuals in these communities are numb to more things that other people would call serious because they're dealing with a whirlwind around them. So it very much comes from a place of understanding, being non-judgmental, me again understanding my privilege through my social location and lived experience, and being able to not judge people based on their circumstances is what I would say.
Amazing. I'll throw the last one a curveball, and if we can keep it to like 1 or 2 sentences.
Mm-hmm.
What's one advice you're going to give to your old 20-year-old self back in the day?
20 years from now?
No. When you were 20 years old,
yeah.
What advice, if you could go back and talk to that gentleman, what advice would you give the 20-year-old Greg?
Oh, you should have stayed in the school, homie, because then you would have had your PhD by now and be able to impart and to change and to shift policies way more than you're doing now. I still definitely have the privilege to be a published therapist, but I would have wanted to have fostered a lot of my education earlier, because I really believe myself to be a system shaker and shaper, and I want to influence policies so that individuals that live in communities like these and families that live in communities like this could have a real access and a chance of living out their lives without some of these social impacts. So go to school, stay in school. Like my mom always says, "Oh my God, when are you going to be finished school?" So to end, I would have said stay in school and finish a lot of my education earlier, so I could have the benefit of using the wealth of my knowledge in a greater influence, is what I would have said.
Lifelong learning, they say, right?
Yes.
It's a life commitment. We're really, really honored to have you as part of Team YAAACE, to work together, to do some publishing together, some activism together, and to really support folks and clients in need of care coordination from that public health, social determinants of health approach. Having said that, I want to thank the listeners for tuning in to another episode of Safer Communities Canada, which is a knowledge mobilization effort for the Center for Community Safety and Roots of Violence. Until next time, take care.
Bye for now.
Take care.
Bye-bye.